and Mexico has as well. So if you ask yourself, we've talked about the Constitution, about 500,000 people in the state of Kentucky ignore the law that is currently written, that's KRS 218A, 1421 to 23, and use cannabis on a daily basis. And so if you ask yourself why, well, I provided you a copy of the Constitution. And the Kentucky Constitution is very clear. It says that every citizen has a right to pursue safety and happiness. And cannabis is safer than alcohol. It's safer than prescription drugs. It's safer than motor vehicles, firearms, chainsaws, and a whole lot of other things. And so, you know, you talked about talking about the Constitution. Well, I think we need to talk about it more and not less. So, but before I begin here, I just want the council to understand my level of motivation. I've spoken on this subject in front of the council for the last 6 years. And the very first thing I said when I addressed the council 6 years ago was the U.S. government violated my civil rights in 2004 when they gave me an illegal drug test when I was a pilot for UPS. And I know that's a lot to consider in one sentence, and I didn't come here just to discuss the Constitution with you, but that's what happened, and that's the reason for my motivation, and I can promise you I'll never stop. Now, you just had some people in here talking about all the drug problems that we have in the country, and I haven't used this, but just rolled in, okay. The reason that we have such a problem with drugs is because we keep ignoring what we call the iron law of prohibition. And prohibition always results in stronger, more dangerous drug use and more violence in the streets. Regulating drugs always results in safer, weaker drugs and less violence in the streets. And you can see this every day. There are different types of prohibition that we have. Criminal penalties. We have an eradication interdiction program where we chop down marijuana plants in the state. Drug testing is a form of prohibition, and we have prescription monitoring. Back in 2012, when the state decided to go with mandatory CASPR, which is our prescription monitoring program, I wrote every legislator in the state, and I said, if you go with mandatory CASPR and you start hassling the doctors for prescription writing, you're going to explode the illicit market for opioids, and more people are going to die. And it's pretty obvious if you look at the overdose fatalities that you've seen, that that's exactly what's happened. So I'm going to discuss each of these types of prohibition in a little bit of detail. The consequences of alcohol prohibition. Well, in 1918, we decided to prohibit alcohol sales in the country, and it was done by a vote of the states. And we thought we'd be a better country, and people would go to church, and there'd be less domestic violence, things like that. And that's not what happened. What happened was it created the demand for alcohol didn't cease, and so instead alcohol was driven underground, and so beer and wine production ceased to be made in the country because it takes up a lot larger space and it's a lot easier to get caught with. So when it was driven underground, it became bootleg whiskey and bathtub gin, and there was a lot of tainted alcohol, and about 50,000 people died from tainted alcohol during that period. There was also a huge increase in law enforcement deaths. A lot of people don't realize this, but do you know the year that had the most law enforcement deaths in the history of the United States was 1930. During Prohibition, we had 308 law enforcement officers die that year. So we finally figured out that this doesn't work, and it also caused economic upheaval in the country because there were a lot of tax dollars that were lost when it went underground. So we finally repealed it in 1933, but we didn't learn our lesson of Prohibition, and that's exactly what I said about the iron law of Prohibition. It always results in more dangerous drugs. So a lot of you guys have probably heard of Dr. Sanjay Gupta. And in 2009, Dr. Gupta wrote an editorial for the New York Times, said why I would vote no on medical marijuana. And he got so much rebuttal for the information that for that editorial that he started researching it on his own. And when he started researching it, he changed his mind. And so if you're undecided, and you said you're undecided, Councilwoman Green, I think if you research it, you'll change your mind. Because, and as Dr. Gupta said, he said we've been terribly and systematically misled for the last 70 years in the United States. Well, terribly means this is a big problem. It affects millions of people. We've had 25 million people arrested in the country that all have records that keep them from, getting a decent job. He also said we've been systematically misled, and that suggests criminality at the very highest levels of our government. One of the reasons Dr. Gupta changed his mind is when he did his research, is he found this report, Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding. And this is commonly called the Schaefer Commission report. It was 1970, Richard Nixon formed a commission to study marijuana in the country. And the commission met for about 2 years, and they came out with a report, and they were going to recommend legalization. But Nixon strong-armed the committee, and they actually ended up coming up with decriminalization. They said in the report that the consequences of marijuana use don't warrant criminal sanctions. But in the part under medical use, they came up with these 4 therapeutic uses. Now, they had a lot of different uses that were discussed, like anorexia and arthritis and Alzheimer's and different things, but the big 4 that they put in the report were glaucoma, migraines, alcoholism, and cancer research. Well, alcoholism is addiction. So they had back in 1972, they said cannabis should be used to treat addiction. Cannabis should be used to get people off of hard drugs. So, but we ignored the report, and instead we criminalized cannabis, and it was really done for political reasons. And obviously the results speak for themselves. So as simply as I can make this, the government misled us. And what they said is, if we reduce marijuana use, we're going to reduce the use of all these other drugs, or the gateway theory. Well, that's not what happened. This is the reality. The more we tried to reduce cannabis use, the more we had an increase in more dangerous drug use, alcohol, prescription drugs, and now you have all the street drugs. So the solution is to increase the use of cannabis, and that will decrease the use of more dangerous drugs. And we've seen this in studies, and we've seen this in the data that's come from the states that have legalized. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk just a little bit about medical marijuana. So I'm not going to talk about specifically about it. I just want to discuss with you why it works. Now, in 2008, this Dr. Ethan Rousseau, who coined this study here on clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, he said if migraine and fibromyalgia and IBS and epilepsy and other diseases, if cannabis treats those diseases, then maybe the underlying pathology is a deficiency, a cannabinoid deficiency, because we all have a cannabinoid system, an endocannabinoid system. Our body creates the same drugs that are actually in marijuana. So I always wondered when I was growing up why some of my friends enjoyed cannabis and others couldn't tolerate it. They didn't like it. And then when I read the study, it finally made sense to me that some people have a deficiency. So my brain is a quart low on cannabinoids, if you will. And if you're not a quart low and you try marijuana, it's not going to be for you. You're going to overdose, not fatally, but it's just not going to be for you. It won't work. But if you are a quart low in your brain on cannabinoids or in your body, then it actually makes you feel better. And so there's a big difference between a deficiency and an addiction.
We've got some colleagues in the queue.
Sure.
I want to be able to let them ask questions
Absolutely.
as you're doing your presentation. Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first question is, I was a little confused. You started with a pretty bold statement. I was confused about how your constitutional rights were violated.
Well, drug testing violates, because it's federally mandated, it's a Fourth and Fifth Amendment violation. It's an unreasonable search because it doesn't show actual impairment, and it's being done at random, which is without probable cause.
Has Has anybody ruled on that, including the state and or federal Supreme Court?
I'm getting to that. Yeah, the Supreme Court has ruled on it, but the Supreme Court wasn't looking at the charts that I'm about to show you when they made that ruling.
I understand, but the point is, the Supreme Court has not ruled that a private employer and or the federal government as an employer or state government, they've not ruled that it's unconstitutional to drug test employees.
No, they haven't, but
Okay.
the Supreme Court gets it wrong often. And these things, when they go through time, when they ruled in favor of drug testing, they weren't looking at the consequences that you see today.
I understand. I mean, look, it's your opinion that your constitutional rights were violated, but
Yes.
I'm going by the way the law works currently.
Right.
What,
Well, I'm planning on changing the law at the federal level.
very well. Why not advocate, and you're talking about, a lot of your argument here, folks, on medicinal marijuana deviates a little bit, I think, from what the point of this was, but, related to the risks of marijuana and cannabis, generally speaking, there's two types, right? There's THC, there's CBD, or two types of chemicals that are active within cannabis plants.
There's actually a lot of different cannabinoids.
Of course, but we're focusing on these two. There's been significant research done, and I'm familiar with some of it, on the benefits that CBD oil as an example, presents, which are very similar to marijuana that is smoked, although it eliminates the hallucinogenic qualities of it. Doesn't that sort of achieve the goal?
Well, I tell you, that would be something that another expert would have to speak to, because I'm not completely expert on that particular, the pharmacology of it.
No problem.
There are definitely CBD drugs that are a benefit to individuals, but there's also THC, like we already have Marinol, which is a synthetic THC pill that's given to people at end of life. So to say CBD is medical and THC is not, it's just not true.
No, one is hallucinogenic and one's not, but they both have similar other effects, right? You want to get
Yes.
the benefits without the risks of the hallucinogenic qualities, right? That would be the ideal circumstance.
Well, if you look at Dr. Gupta's research, he talks about what's called the entourage effect, and where they actually work better when they're together. When the cannabis, and the whole plant cannabis actually works better than the individual cannabinoids by themselves.
Right. Yeah, there's also studies that show an increase, or at least a link to, they're just got to sort out the details of it, but links to bipolar disorder and other mental health issues.
Well, and
related
that's
to
a
the
chicken or the egg argument. Do people who have bipolar issues seek out cannabis, or does cannabis cause it?
Exactly right. They
And
haven't sorted
yeah.
that out yet.
Right,
Agreed.
exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
and I think we should before we, go prescribing in every place, but at least the hallucinogenic side of this, I realize there's medicinal benefit to it, and that's great.
Right.
But so to get back to really what the point of this is, what I don't see here is, and I'd be interested in this, is you're talking more broadly about making marijuana and cannabis more ubiquitously available to the public, right? Federally, state, locally. The question really is, do we, to Chairwoman Green's point, reduce it as a law enforcement priority, not to improve everybody's happiness related to their use of cannabis, but rather to acknowledge that it may not be the most appropriate use of the time and the effort of LMPD and the sheriff's office related to focusing on that crime versus focusing on other crimes. So do you have any data or information that shows in states, regardless of their legalization, actually I'd be more interested in states that don't have legalization, because that would more closely mirror the Commonwealth and Jefferson County, where local police departments have moved down in their priority list the arrests or focus on individual use of marijuana, maybe still going after gangs and other organized crime around drug distribution and use, but I don't want to say decriminalizing because it's still criminal, but reducing its priority and what impact that's had to the criminal justice system and law and order in those jurisdictions. Do we have anything like that here?
Well, the number of arrests have definitely gone down in states that have legalized it. There's no doubt about that, individual arrest. And the LLEPO comes from a number of cities across the country that have passed similar ordinances. And basically what the LLEPO does is says, look, the state and the federal government have this wrong, and we need to stop creating records for people that are going to have to be expunged, because you actually have mass expungement going on in other cities across the country. For instance, San Francisco expunged 9,000 records in the last few days for marijuana convictions.
Yeah, no, just to be clear, good for San Francisco. But my point is, we're not San Francisco. We still have, it's still illegal in this Commonwealth. I'm curious about if you can produce some more information, maybe later, maybe today you don't have it, maybe at a later date, information on jurisdictions within a state or a Commonwealth where marijuana is still illegal, where they can't decriminalize it, because we can't, but we can make it a lower law enforcement priority. That's something we can control.
Right.
And what the impact has been on the local residency related to incarceration, related to costs to local and state governments, related to incarceration. I think I'm very interested in that, which is something we can control, and also related to other crime rates, stuff like that. I realize crime rates go down when you make it legal,
Right.
but when it's still illegal, but you reduce the focus on it from a local law enforcement point of view, what impact does that have? I think that's missing here, and I think if you could look at that type scenario, that'd be great.
One thing I can speak to, I've talked to police officers here, and they've said that it kind of already is the unofficial position of the police. We talked to a guy just last Thursday when Charles Forsythe spoke here, and one of the LMPD officers followed us out. And he said, look, unless you have a whole lot on you, we're probably not going to do anything but tell you to dump it out, okay? So
You're sort of getting to my point, right?
I am, and so what I was going to say is this. Last year, or actually 2016, there were 678 possession arrests in Jefferson County. Lexington had 978. So they had considerably more arrests, and they're about half the population. So I think it would definitely improve as far as that goes. And then to speak to the health consequences, this is something we don't talk about. I mean, what are the health effects of arrest, incarceration, job loss, property confiscation? What are those health effects on the public? Actually, Courier Journal did a study, and they found that there's over a 10-year discrepancy in the longevity or lifespan of people who live in the richest zip codes in Jefferson County from the people who live in the poorest. So poverty definitely has a huge effect on a person's health, because if they don't have any money, they can't, get health care.
Understood. We're crossing into a whole other conversation.
Okay.
Make a final statement, and I'll yield to the rest of my colleagues here.
Okay.
But the point is, to your point, if it's already being done here, right, what would be the future impact? In reality, what I'm curious about, and I think what we really need research on, and maybe this is more coming out of the chief's office or somebody else, but what, if the LMPD is already using it as a secondary crime, they're not pursuing it as a primary. It sounds like they might already be doing that. I'd be shocked if how often they're primarily arresting people for that versus arresting for something else, or just tacking on crimes because they want to, increase, or prosecutors maybe even doing it. So we'd have to talk to the county attorney's office, right, LMPD, to understand how often they're doing it, and if we stopped doing that, then what would that impact be? And I think
The LLEPO takes their unofficial position and makes it official, is essentially what it does. If that's the unofficial position, why not make it the official position, so the citizens in the county can breathe a little easier and realize that they're not going to get arrested if they're, on their back porch or in their basement consuming some cannabis.
Welcome, Councilman Triplett. Councilwoman Flood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what we're looking for is what we're going to do as a community with the police department, with the budget that we're facing too, about what to do with people. But I wanted to say that I did a lot of research back when we were talking about it to do the resolution to the state, and I found Dr. Sanjay Gupta's report before you've ever said anything about it. It was a very interesting read, because up until 1943, marijuana was one of the pharmaceutical choices in our plethora of medications up until 1943. Then all of a sudden, all these tests or research is being done, but there was some horrible number, like way up into the 90s to 90%, past 90%, to prove the ill effects of marijuana or cannabis versus what it does good for the human body. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is that My son, who is a disabled vet, who suffers from horrible neuropathic pain, and Dr. Sonia Gupta and other well-known neurologists will say that there is no pain in the world worse than neuropathic pain, because you don't get rid of it. It's just there.
Right.
And that the medicine that we are given, the medicine that my son takes, will kill him. It will kill him. It will flat kill him. They told us from the time he was injured that his life expectancy was 20 years, maybe 30. And it's the medicine that he's taking. It's the stuff that's legal, but it's going to kill him. I mean, we come to find out now that Tylenol will kill organs. You know, NSAIDs. You can't take NSAIDs if you have any type of kidney disease. So, you know, I'm not advocating either way, other than I think it's sad that we are criminalizing people that are probably seeking things for medical reasons. I'm not talking about buying street drugs on the street. I'm talking about people that are, especially when you have the VA doctors in some states that are turning a blind eye to their patients that are testing positive for cannabis, just because they understand that the prescription they're going to write these people are going to kill them. So,
And that's happening here. I mean, I work with several veterans, and there's one just recently that I talked to, going to talk to him tomorrow, and he's going to leave the state, actually, is what he said, because he refused to take a drug test. You know, he told him that he used cannabis, and that takes about 11 different medicines away that he doesn't have to use anymore. And so, again, it's a bigger problem, and that's why I came down prepared to speak to the little larger issue here. But no, I appreciate that. And have you considered cannabis therapy for your son?
he will make his own. He has a philosophical issue because he has children, and he has to weigh philosophically how you rear your children. And I don't think that he would ever use it. You know, that's a choice he'll have to make.
We've had a lot of refugees leave the state.
Well, he was advised by doctors to leave. He was advised by doctors to leave the state of Kentucky and to move to another state that would allow him to get relief from that.
The majority of doctors aren't against it. It's just the leadership at the KMA that's really against it. And, you know, that's what we're up against. And, you know, obviously I wouldn't be here talking to you if we had any success in Frankfort. But we're not having any success in Frankfort. And that's why I'm trying to urge you all to pass a lowest law enforcement priority ordinance to just send a message that, hey, we're not going to arrest anybody in Louisville again anymore unless there's more crime. We don't want to create records that are going to need to be expunged. And as I said before, there are definitely health detriments to being arrested and incarcerated or having it on your record.
Councilman Fox.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm kind of in the same position my distinguished colleague, Councilman Piagettini, was in with your opening statement, because I too worked at a place that required a drug test. Required a lot of tests, as a matter of fact, all of which I agreed to work there. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a violation of my civil rights. I essentially consented. It was a consent, not a violation, and I would be surprised if that was not the case in your employer as well. That being said, you referenced arrests in Louisville and Lexington. Are those physical arrests, or are those places where folks were cited?
As far as I know, they were actual arrests.
House Bill 463, when it was passed several years ago, pretty much did what this ordinance, in a nutshell, did, and that is required citations to be issued in lieu of misdemeanor arrest. And I believe Madam Chair, in her experience with the defense bar, is very familiar with that as well. When I left LMPD 3 years ago, there was not a policy that you could not use this as a primary offense. I'd be surprised that that's the case now. But House Bill 463 kind of took care of what we're getting to in the language of this ordinance, I believe, in that folks get a citation for personal use. And we all have opinions on marijuana, myself included, and I was a police officer for 34 years, and I really didn't see, I really didn't see a big problem on the user end. I'll be quite honest with you. The problems I saw were generally in the production and trafficking end. But that's another discussion for another day. But appreciate your information. It's very enlightening.
There's two criminal bills, decrim bills now in Frankfurt, one in the Senate and one in the House, to even lower it further to a $100 citation. But again, we can't get a hearing in Frankfurt on that either. So, you know, they've had the whole session. There's 5 or 6 different bills, and they're not willing to hear any of them.
I'd just be willing to, or I'd be interested to know how many of those arrests that you cited were folks getting tickets. In my experience since 463, it was very unusual to see an arrest for a low-level amount of marijuana absent another charge. So with that, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilwoman Sexton Smith.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I have already stated publicly on a number of occasions that I am in full support of decriminalizing marijuana in Kentucky. And I know that we cannot do that at a local level. And I've made that decision based on research I've done and studies that I have looked at that show the racial disparity in the arrest. And although we already know through studies that nationally speaking, blacks and whites will use marijuana at roughly the same rate, blacks are arrested 6 times at a rate 6 times higher than whites. That's completely unacceptable. And of the study referenced earlier of 1,708 arrests, 67% of those were black. And I've been looking to answer or dovetail back into a comment or question by Councilman Piagentini, you know, where do we go from here? What can we do? What other things are being done? The research is available, and many jurisdictions are so far ahead of us. And those are Minneapolis, New York, Philadelphia, Brooklyn. Some mayors have ordered to vacate, going back as far as the mid-70s, all charges. I'm very interested in us looking at this, not just from the medical use and the arrest rates. I'm more interested in what kind of effect do these arrest rates have on our entire society? Because once someone has that on their arrest record, as you know, Madam Chair, it becomes the deterrent that keeps them from getting a job. It becomes the deterrent that keeps them from being able to rent the apartment. Then the entire family structure is devastated and destructed once again. So there are obvious data points available to see the racial disparities. And once again, I'd like to state for the record, I am in favor of decriminalizing marijuana because I think it's the right thing to do at the right time for the right reason. So, Madam Chair, thank you for bringing in this specialist to speak to us today. Thank you, Mr. Richter.
And I wanted to say, to my colleague's point, Councilman Fox, who mentioned, well, maybe they were just cited. That still doesn't mean that there's not a cost to the city. Something as simple as printing out paperwork to hand out citations is a cost. The fact that we would have an officer having to type up something is a cost. When it gets to the courthouse and it has to come in front of a judge and come in front of the assistant deputies in the courtroom, that is a cost that we as a city are incurring. And I think that what we have to decide as a civilized society and as a city that is in dire straits for every last dime that we can get is whether or not this continues to be a good usage of our energy and of our dollars. And so the effects on the back end of an individual having to wait 5 years to have a misdemeanor expunged from their record and having to scrounge up $500, there are long-lasting effects that go well beyond whether or not anybody individually, I think personally, likes the idea of marijuana or doesn't like the idea of marijuana. Councilman Piagentini.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So in that, can we request that, because I don't know if I'm going to make a statement quite as bold as the Honorable Councilwoman Barbara Sexton Smith here. Yeah, well, as she tells me, do not be afraid. But I think I think it's a reasonable thing to say. What the cost is one element of this, and to your point, I think societal cost trickles into, what happens to that individual, right? And what's the cost to them? What's the cost to their inability to find work, potentially because of that, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm fine with exploring reducing the focus on it, reducing the criminalization of it at a local level in some limited capacity, right? But I'm curious if we can get, and have we already had, and maybe this was just before my time here, the police department and other law enforcement agencies and/or experts in that area, as well as potentially somebody, I'm not sure who it would be, but somebody to discuss the larger socioeconomic impact.
Yeah, we invited LMPD today, we invited the administration today, and they both declined, indicating that they did not have positions on this at all yet. They may be willing to provide us some hard numbers, perhaps, but I don't know that they're willing to take really a stance. I will tell you that in terms of numbers as related to the jail, I've heard that it costs anywhere from a minimum of $70 to house an individual, upwards to $400 or $500 a day if an individual is sick, on insulin, detoxing, if they're arrested. So those are numbers that we do know of, and I will see if we can get some numbers while they maybe mull over where they may end up on this.
Right, if nothing else, just what's the current count of those either, in any portion of the criminal justice system that are there due primarily to this? Again, I think there's cases where they were primarily arrested for some other crime of a higher caliber, and they happen to have some small amount of marijuana on them, and then they're tacking on additional charges. But if that's the primary reason, I would love to understand the cost there, and and again, understand what the trickle-down impact on their lives are as well. Thank you.
Councilwoman Sexton Smith.
Yes, I think Councilman Piagentini may have just answered my question in his very last sentence. As we talk about the cost of this, I too am very interested in not just the cost to our correction system, because we know that we have 1,793 beds in the jail, and we average 2,200 folks a day. So we have this massive overcrowding problem with the costs that are associated to that, as well as the average cost per day per person there, anywhere from 70 to, I had heard 250, but I think gets as high as 450, depending on the medical situation. Chair Green, as you think about inviting folks to come and talk with us, I think we really need someone who can help us understand the cost to that person's family unit, and which is what you mentioned at the tail end of your question about the cost, not to necessarily to society. I'm interested in the family structure that gets completely broken, and many families are not able to ever find their way and work their way out of that. And we have done this. We've done this in America. The war on drugs became the war on many people and the war on the family. And if we wonder why so many families are broken today, just look at these arrest records that we're talking about. And then we don't want to hire people. And then I'm not saying we don't, but then companies won't hire people, and people can't get mortgages and can't lease apartments, and the whole structure falls apart. So, Councilman Green, thank you so very much.
If I could make one more point about the cost. My research indicates that 26% of the murders in Kentucky go unsolved, and that there's around 107,000 property crimes or total crimes committed in Kentucky annually, and about 40,000 of those go unsolved. And I think we're wasting valuable police resources that could be used to solve those crimes as opposed to arresting people for drug charges.
Thank you. Any other questions, colleagues? If not, thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Rector. We will probably continue our discussion in this committee at some point on some other questions, and bring perhaps some other individuals who deem themselves to be experts to continue our discussion to see where, if any direction, we may want to end up going on this. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for your time.
Without objection, colleagues, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, David.
People are valuable, and no matter where you come from, and no matter who you are and no matter your circumstances, that, you know, we're all valuable to our communities, to our world. You know, I got the easy job. I just provide the support for people to do the hard